The Harper farmhouse sat at the edge of a quiet dirt road, surrounded by acres of open land that once felt alive with laughter. Now it stood still, too still. The wind moved through the tall grass, brushing against the wooden walls like a whisper. No one answered. Inside, Daniel Harper stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly at the dishes soaking in cloudy water. His hands were rough, worn from years of work, but lately, even simple tasks felt heavier than they should. The house behind him was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest. 2 years. That's how long it had been since his wife passed away. 2 years since warmth had left the rooms. 2 years of trying to be both father and mother and feeling like he was failing at both. "Dinner's ready," Daniel called out, his voice low and tired. There was no immediate response. After a moment, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. Emma, his oldest, at 12, appeared first. Her hair was tied back neatly, her expression more serious than any child's should be. She didn't say much, just nodded and moved to help set the table without being asked. Behind her came Lily, 8 years old, clutching the sleeve of her sweater. She avoided eye contact, her small shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to disappear. Once full of chatter, she had grown quiet over the past year, speaking only when necessary. Last came Sophie, 5 years old, dragging her stuffed rabbit along the floor. Her wide eyes looked up at Daniel with innocent hope. "Daddy," she asked softly, "is Mommy coming back tonight?" The question hit like it always did, sharp and sudden. Daniel froze for a split second, then forced a gentle expression. "Not tonight, sweetheart." Sophie nodded slowly, as if she almost understood. She climbed into her chair, hugging her toy a little tighter. Dinner passed in near silence. The clinking of forks against plates sounded louder than usual. Emma occasionally reminded Sophie to eat her vegetables. Lily barely touched her food. Daniel tried to think of something to say, anything, but the words never came. Conversation used to flow so easily when his wife was there. She filled the spaces, brought light into ordinary moments. Without her, everything felt incomplete. After dinner, Emma automatically began clearing the table. "You don't have to do that alone," Daniel said quietly. "It's okay," she replied, not looking at him. "I've got it," and she did. That was the problem. Later that night, the house grew even quieter as darkness settled outside. Daniel sat in the living room, staring at an old photograph resting on the shelf. It showed all 5 of them smiling, arms wrapped around each other, sunlight bright in the background. It felt like a different lifetime. A soft sound from the hallway caught his attention. He stood and walked slowly toward the girls' room. The door was slightly open. Inside, a dim lamp cast a warm glow. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, gently brushing Sophie's hair while Lily lay beside her, eyes open. "It's okay," Emma whispered softly. "Mommy's still watching us. She just can't come back." "But I miss her," Sophie murmured. "I do too," Emma said, her voice trembling just slightly. Every day, Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, unseen. Emma continued, trying to sound strong. "I'll take care of you. I promise." Those words hit harder than anything else. She shouldn't have to say that. She was just a child. Daniel stepped back quietly, not wanting to interrupt. He returned to the living room, but something inside him had shifted, cracked open in a way he couldn't ignore. He had been so focused on holding everything together, on surviving, that he hadn't realized how much his daughters were carrying on their own. The silence in the house wasn't just grief. It was loneliness. And they were all trapped in it. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. For the first time in a long while, he didn't try to push the feeling away. He let it sit with him. Because deep down, he knew something had to change. Not just for him, but for them. Outside, the wind continued to move through the fields, but inside that quiet farmhouse, something fragile had begun to stir, not hope. Exactly, not yet. But the first awareness that they couldn't go on like this forever. The rain began just after noon. Dark clouds rolled in over the fields, swallowing the pale blue sky and casting a gray hush across the land. Daniel had been outside repairing a loose section of fencing when the first drops hit slow, heavy, deliberate. Within minutes, the drizzle turned steady, soaking through his shirt and dampening the dry earth beneath his boots. He worked a little longer than he should have. It was easier to stay busy than to go back inside, but eventually, the cold rain forced him in. By the time Daniel stepped onto the porch, water dripped from his sleeves and mud clung to his boots. He pushed open the front door, expecting the same stillness that greeted him every day. Instead, he found Emma standing near the window, staring outside. "Someone's here," she said quietly. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma stepped aside slightly, giving him a clear view through the rain-streaked glass. At the far edge of the yard, just beyond the wooden gate, stood a woman. She wasn't moving. She held a small worn bag in one hand, her other arm wrapped around herself as if trying to keep warm. Her clothes were simple and slightly damp, her hair darkened by the rain. Even from a distance, there was something about her stillness, not hesitation exactly, but patience. Daniel felt a flicker of unease. "We don't get visitors," he muttered. Emma said nothing, but her eyes remained fixed on the woman. After a moment, Daniel grabbed his jacket and stepped back outside. The rain had softened slightly, but the air was cold, carrying that quiet tension that comes before a storm fully settles in. He walked across the yard, boots pressing into the wet ground, until he reached the gate. Up close, the woman looked even more worn than he expected, not in a careless way, but like someone who had been traveling for a long time without rest. Her eyes lifted to meet his, calm but tired. "Can I help you?" Daniel asked, his voice guarded. The woman nodded politely. "I hope so." Her voice was soft, steady despite the weather. "My name is Clara," she said. "I'm looking for work." Daniel's expression didn't change. "What kind of work?" "Any kind," she replied. "Cleaning, cooking, helping around the house. I don't need much. Just a place to stay. And something to do." The rain tapped lightly against the wooden fence between them. Daniel studied her carefully. Strangers didn't just show up out here asking for work, not like this. And trust wasn't something he gave easily anymore. "I'm not hiring," he said plainly. Clara nodded again, as if she expected the answer. She didn't argue, she didn't plead. "I understand," she said. "Thank you for your time." She shifted her bag slightly, preparing to leave, and for a moment, Daniel felt a strange pull, something quiet but persistent. Maybe it was the way she didn't try to convince him. Maybe it was the way she stood there in the rain without complaint. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Before he could think too much about it, a small voice called out from behind him, "Wait." Daniel turned. Sophie stood just a few steps away on the porch, barefoot despite the cold, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She had followed him outside without him noticing. Her wide eyes were fixed on Clara. Without hesitation, Sophie walked forward, her tiny feet stepping into the damp grass. Daniel started to stop her, but paused. Sophie reached the gate and gently slipped her small hand through the wooden slats. Clara looked down, surprised. "It's okay," Sophie said softly. "You can come in." Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck. "Sweetheart," he began, but Sophie didn't look at him. Her attention stayed on Clara, as if she had already decided something important. Clara hesitated, clearly unsure. "I don't want to impose," she said gently. Daniel looked between them, his youngest daughter, open and trusting. "And the Woman at the gate, quiet and respectful. Emma had stepped onto the porch now too, watching silently. Even Lily stood just inside the doorway, peeking out. For the first time in a long while, something different hung in the air. Not EAVINESS. Silence, something uncertain, but alive. Daniel let out a slow breath. It's just temporary, he said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. You can stay a few days, help out, that's all. Clara's expression softened, not relief exactly, but gratitude. That's more than enough, she said. Daniel opened the gate. As Clara stepped inside. The rain seemed to ease, falling softer against the earth. Sophie smiled, a small, quiet smile, but one Daniel hadn't seen in a long time, and though he didn't fully understand it yet, as he watched Clara walk toward the house, Daniel felt it again, that subtle shift, like something had just crossed the threshold, and nothing would be quite the same anymore. Clara's presence in the Harper farmhouse began quietly, so quietly, in fact, that for the first day, it almost felt as if nothing had changed at all. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to learn everything at once. Instead, she observed. Next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise as usual, expecting to find the kitchen cold and still. But when he stepped inside, he paused. A soft hum filled the room. Clara stood by the stove, gently stirring something in a pot. The sound was barely louder than the crackle of the flame beneath it, a simple, wordless melody. It wasn't meant to be heard. It just existed. She glanced over her shoulder when she noticed him. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm. Daniel nodded, unsure how to respond. "You didn't have to wake up this early." "I'm used to it," she replied. There was no insistence in her tone. No need to prove anything, just a quiet statement. The smell of warm food filled the kitchen, something richer than the quick, practical meals Daniel usually made. It wasn't extravagant, just simple, but cared for. The girls noticed too. Sophie was the first to wander in, rubbing her eyes. She stopped when she saw Clara, then smiled, a small, instinctive smile. "Are you staying?" she asked. "For a little while," Clara said gently. Sophie nodded as if that answer was enough. Emma entered next, already dressed, her usual seriousness in place. She looked at the table, then at Clara, noticing the neatly arranged plates. "You don't have to do all this," Emma said. Clara met her gaze. "I know." That answer seemed to catch Emma off guard. Lily lingered in the doorway, hesitant as always. Clara didn't call her in or try to draw her out. She simply continued what she was doing, and after a few seconds, Lily stepped inside. On her own, it was a small thing, but Daniel noticed. Over the next few days, Clara settled into the house like a soft rhythm, not loud enough to demand attention, but steady enough to be felt. She didn't rearrange their lives, she gently filled the gaps. The laundry that usually piled up was folded before anyone mentioned it. The kitchen stayed warm longer into the evening. The house, once heavy with silence, now carried small, almost unnoticed sounds, humming, soft footsteps. The occasional quiet laugh from Sophie. Clara never tried to replace what had been lost, and somehow that made all the difference. One afternoon, Daniel returned from the fields earlier than expected. As he approached the house, he heard something unfamiliar drifting through the open window. Laughter. He stopped. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. But then it came again, light, unguarded, real. He stepped inside slowly. In the living room, Sophie was spinning in circles while Clara clapped gently, encouraging her. Emma sat nearby, watching with a faint smile she didn't seem to realize she was showing, and Lily was speaking. "She's going too fast," Lily said quietly, a hint of amusement in her voice. Daniel stood frozen near the doorway. It had been weeks, maybe months, since he'd heard her speak more than a few words. Clara didn't react in any exaggerated way. She simply nodded. "Maybe we should slow her down then," she said softly. No pressure. No spotlight. Just acceptance. Lily didn't retreat. Instead, she stayed. That night, dinner felt different. Not louder, not forced, but lighter. Sophie talked about her spinning game. Emma mentioned school without being asked. Lily listened and once or twice even added something small. Daniel found himself watching more than eating, trying to understand how this was happening. After dinner, as the girls moved to their room, Daniel remained at the table. Clara began clearing plates quietly. "You don't have to do everything," he said, his voice low. Clara shook her head slightly. "I'm not doing everything." Daniel frowned faintly. "It just feels that way because you've been doing it." "Alone," she added gently. Her words weren't critical. Just honest. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting that settle. For so long, he had carried the weight without question, believing that was what he was supposed to do. But now, seeing the way the girls responded to something as simple as attention, warmth, he realized something uncomfortable. Maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe they needed more than just getting through each day. Across the room, Clara folded a small towel and placed it neatly on the counter. There was nothing extraordinary about what she was doing, and yet the house felt different. Not because the past had disappeared, not because the pain was gone, but because, slowly, almost invisibly, someone was helping them breathe again. Daniel exhaled quietly, his shoulders easing in a way they hadn't in a long time. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in the house wasn't suffocating. It was changing. And though he didn't fully understand how or why, he knew one thing for certain. Clara hadn't just come to help. She had brought something with her. Something small, something steady, something that felt, just barely, like hope. His days grew steadier, but Daniel kept his distance. It wasn't unkindness. It wasn't even distrust. Not anymore. It was something quieter, harder to name, a habit maybe, or a kind of protection he had built around himself without realizing it. Clara moved through the house like she always had, gentle, consistent, never demanding space she wasn't given. She helped the girls with small things, kept the rhythm of the home balanced, and never once asked Daniel for anything beyond what had already been agreed. And yet, something between them was shifting, not loudly, not obviously, but it was there. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Daniel returned home later than usual. The sky had already turned a deep shade of blue, and a cool breeze settled over the land. The lights inside the house were dim, casting a soft glow through the windows. He stepped inside quietly. The girls were already asleep. For a moment, he stood in the hallway, listening. The house wasn't silent anymore, not in that heavy, empty way. There was a kind of stillness now that felt calmer. Balanced. He moved toward the kitchen, expecting to find it empty, but Clara was there. She stood near the counter, a small lamp illuminating the space around her. A cup of tea rested in her hands, steam rising gently into the air. She didn't seem surprised to see him, just glanced up with a soft acknowledgement. "You're late," she said. "Work ran longer," Daniel replied. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, just quiet. Daniel reached for a glass, filling it with water. He hesitated, then leaned lightly against the counter, unsure why he didn't just walk away like he usually would. Clara didn't fill the silence. She simply stood there, present. After a moment, Daniel spoke again. "The girls. They've been better." It wasn't quite a question, but it carried one. Clara nodded slightly. "They've been feeling safer." Daniel looked at her. "Safer? Safer? They don't feel like they have to hold everything in anymore," she said gently. "Children don't always need answers. Sometimes they just need space to feel." Her words settled quietly between them. Daniel stared down at the glass in his hand. I thought I was giving them that. He admitted. You were giving them strength, Clara replied. That matters too. There was no judgment in her tone. No correction, just understanding. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't always know what they need, he said. Tried to keep things together. Clara took a small sip of her tea. That's what you've had to do, she said. But holding everything together isn't the same as letting it breathe. Daniel didn't respond right away. Her words didn't feel like criticism, but they still reached something deeper than he expected. For a long time, he had believed that staying strong meant staying closed. That if he kept moving, kept working, kept everything from falling apart, then somehow that would be enough. But now, watching the changes in his daughters, feeling the difference in the house, he wasn't so sure anymore. Later that night, Daniel stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cool, the sky clear and scattered with stars. The field stretched endlessly into the darkness, quiet and familiar. He heard the door open behind him. Clara stepped out, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, leaving a respectful space between them. They looked out over the land together. It's peaceful here, she said softly. Daniel nodded. It used to feel fuller. Clara didn't ask what he meant. I lost my family a long time ago, she said after a moment. Daniel glanced at her. Surprised. She kept her eyes forward. It changes how you see things, she continued. The silence, the spaces people leave behind. Her voice wasn't heavy with sorrow. It was calm. Live in. Daniel felt something shift again, something quieter than before, but deeper. You don't talk about it much, he said. There isn't always something to say, Clara replied. Some things don't need explaining. They just stay with you. Daniel understood that. More than he expected. The wind moved gently across the fields, brushing past them both. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt shared. Not empty, but understood. Daniel leaned his arms against the porch railing, his shoulders less tense than usual. I'm not used to this, he admitted quietly. Clara looked at him. What? Not feeling like everything's about to fall apart. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her expression. Maybe it isn't, she said. Daniel let out a slow breath, his gaze returning to the horizon. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he had to carry everything alone, and though nothing dramatic had changed, no grand moment, no sudden answers, something real had begun, not just in the house, but in him. The walls he had built weren't gone, but they weren't as solid as they used to be. The change didn't happen all at once. It came in small, almost invisible moments, the kind most people would overlook. But in the Harper house, those moments mattered. They were everything. It started on a quiet afternoon. Rain had passed earlier that morning, leaving the air fresh and cool. Sunlight filtered through the windows in soft golden streaks, warming the wooden floors. Clara stood at the kitchen table, sorting through a small stack of papers Emma had brought home from school. Emma hovered nearby, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. I don't need help, she said quickly, her voice a little too firm. I just thought you might look at it. Clara didn't challenge her. She simply glanced at the paper in her hands. It looks important, Emma shrugged. It's just a project. Clara nodded. Tell me about it. There was no pressure in her tone, no expectation. Just quiet interest. Emma hesitated. Then, slowly, she stepped closer. It's about family history, she said. We have to write about where we come from and what matters to us. Her voice softened on the last part. Clara listened carefully. That sounds meaningful. Emma let out a small breath. I don't know what to write. It was a simple admission, but for Emma, it wasn't easy. She had spent so long trying to have everything figured out, trying to fill the role she thought she had to take. Clara pulled out a chair. Then maybe we don't start with writing. Emma frowned slightly. What do you mean? We start with remembering, Clara said gently. Emma looked down at the paper again, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges. I don't want to forget her, she said quietly. Clara's expression softened. You won't. There was a pause. Then Clara added, remembering someone doesn't mean you have to stay in the sadness they left behind. Emma looked up, her eyes searching Clara's face as if trying to understand something she hadn't heard before. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, slowly, she nodded. They spent the next hour sitting together at the table, not writing, not rushing, just talking. About small memories, about moments that mattered, about laughter. And somewhere in that quiet conversation, something shifted. Across the room, Sophie played with her stuffed rabbit, occasionally spinning in circles the way she loved to do. Clara smiled at her gently, encouraging her with soft claps. Careful, Lily said suddenly from the couch. Emma and Clara both looked up. Lily sat there, watching closely. Her voice had been quiet but clear. She might fall, Lily added. Sophie stopped spinning and giggled. I won't. Clara crouched slightly. Maybe we spin a little slower? Sophie nodded enthusiastically and tried again, this time more carefully. Lily watched for a moment longer, then relaxed back into the couch. Daniel stepped into the doorway just then, unnoticed. He had come in from outside, expecting the usual calm, quiet atmosphere, but what he found was different. Emma was leaning over the table, talking, not just answering, but sharing. Lily had spoken without being prompted. And Sophie was laughing. Not the small, distracted kind of laughter Daniel had grown used to. This was full, bright, unfiltered. He stood there longer than he meant to, taking it in. For a second, it felt unfamiliar. Then something deeper stirred. Something he hadn't felt in a long time, relief. Later that evening, something unexpected happened. As Clara began setting the table for dinner, Emma stepped forward. I can do that, she said. Clara looked at her. We can do it together. Emma hesitated, then nodded. Lily quietly brought over napkins without being asked, and Sophie carefully placed spoons beside each plate, concentrating hard on getting it right. Daniel watched it all unfold. No one had been told what to do. No one had been instructed. They were simply doing it. Together. When they finally sat down, the table felt fuller than it had in years. Not because of the food, but because of something else. Something harder to describe. Can Clara sit with us? Sophie asked suddenly. Daniel glanced at Clara. She paused slightly. I usually eat after. No, Emma interrupted softly. You should sit now. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. Clara looked at Daniel, unsure. For a brief moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Sit, he said. Clara took a seat at the table, and just like that, something changed. Dinner wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. Sophie talked about her spinning. Lily listened, occasionally adding a word or two. Emma spoke about her project again, this time with more confidence. And Daniel found himself smiling, not out of politeness, not out of effort. But, naturally, it was small, barely noticeable, but it was real. The first real smile in longer than he could remember. Across the table, Clara noticed. She didn't point it out. She didn't say anything. She just let the moment exist. And in that quiet, ordinary evening filled with soft voices, shared glances, and simple warmth, the Harper house didn't feel broken anymore, not completely healed, not whole. but no longer lost, for the first time in a long while. It felt like a place where life was slowly returning. For a while, everything felt steady, not perfect, but real in a way the Harper house hadn't felt in years. The days had found a rhythm, the nights no longer felt as heavy, and the quiet spaces in between were no longer filled with silence, but with something softer, something warmer. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. Clara felt it long before anyone else did. It came in small moments, the way Sophie reached for her hand without thinking, the way Lily lingered close instead of staying distant, the way Emma began to trust her with things she hadn't shared with anyone else, and Daniel had started to look at her differently. Not with hesitation anymore, but with something quieter, something deeper. That was when the fear began. It wasn't sudden. It didn't arrive like a storm. It settled in slowly, like a shadow stretching across something bright, because Clara knew something the others didn't. Single quotes T. She had never meant to stay. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the fields, Clara stood alone in the small room she had been using. Her bag rested open on the bed, the same worn bag she had arrived with. She hadn't unpacked much. She never did. Her fingers moved slowly as she folded the few clothes she owned, placing them carefully inside. Each movement was quiet, deliberate. Final. From the hallway, the sound of laughter drifted in. Sophie. Clara paused. For a moment, she closed her eyes, then she continued packing. Downstairs, Daniel stepped inside after finishing his work for the day. He brushed the dust from his hands and glanced around the room. Something felt off. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. "Where's Clara?" he asked. Emma looked up from the table. "Upstairs, I think." Daniel nodded and moved toward the staircase. As he reached the top, he noticed the door to Clara's room slightly open. He knocked gently. No response. He pushed the door a little wider and stopped. Clara stood by the bed, her bag half filled. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel stepped inside. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara didn't turn right away. "Yes," she said softly. The words settled heavily in the room. Daniel frowned. "Why?" Clara finally looked at him. Her expression was calm, but there was something behind it. Something she was holding back. "I was never meant to stay long," she said. "That was always the plan." Daniel shook his head slightly. "That was before." Clara's gaze lowered. "That doesn't change what this was," she replied. "Was?" Daniel repeated, his voice tightening just slightly. Clara took a breath. "This was temporary," she said. "It was supposed to help, not become something permanent." Daniel stepped closer. "It already has," he said. Clara's hands tightened slightly at her sides. "That's exactly why I have to go." The words landed harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Daniel stared at her. "That doesn't make any sense." "It does," Clara said quietly. "You just don't want it to." There was no accusation in her voice, only truth. Daniel's frustration flickered, but beneath it, something else surfaced. Something deeper. "Then explain it to me," he said. Clara hesitated. Then, slowly, she spoke. "When people lose enough, they start to hold on too tightly to anything that feels like it might stay," she said. "And when that thing disappears, it hurts even more." Daniel's expression shifted. "And you think that's what this is?" he asked. "I think your daughters are healing," Clara replied. "And they deserve to do that without depending on someone who is never meant to be here forever." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "They don't see you that way," he said. Clara's voice softened. "That doesn't mean I should let them." There was a long silence. Then a small voice broke through it. "You're leaving?" Both of them turned. Emma stood in the doorway. Behind her, Lily and Sophie hovered close. Clara's heart sank. No one had heard them come up. Sophie stepped forward first, her eyes already filling with confusion. But you said you were staying? She whispered. Clara knelt down in front of her, her movements gentle. I said I was staying for a little while, she corrected softly. Sophie shook her head. No, you're part of here. The words were simple, but they carried everything. Lily looked down, her hands gripping the edge of her sleeve. Emma didn't move. Her voice, when it came, was steady but strained. You didn't just help. Emma said quietly, you stayed. Clara's breath caught. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Because Emma was right. She had stayed. Longer than she planned. Longer than she should have. Long enough for it to matter. And that was exactly the problem. Clara stood slowly, her eyes moving from one girl to the next. This wasn't what she wanted. The house felt different that night. Not like before. Clara had arrived empty and heavy but unsettled. As if something important was hanging in the balance, waiting for a decision no one could make except one person. No one slept easily. Sophie had cried herself to sleep, her small hands clutching the edge of Clara's sleeve until Emma gently led her back to bed. Lily stayed quiet, but her silence had weight again, the kind that returned when something fragile was threatened. Emma didn't cry. She just watched. And Daniel sat alone in the living room long after the lights were turned off, staring at nothing in particular, his thoughts louder than the quiet around him. Clara's bag still rested upstairs, half packed, half stayed. By morning, the tension hadn't eased. Clara moved through the kitchen as she always did, preparing breakfast with the same calm rhythm, but something had changed. The hum in her voice was gone. The girls noticed. Sophie sat at the table, unusually quiet, her eyes following Clara's every movement as if trying to understand something she didn't have words for. Lily barely touched her food. Emma kept her gaze down, her expression guarded. Daniel stepped in last. He looked at Clara, then at the girls, and for a moment he said nothing, because he knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with routine or silence. Clara placed the last plate on the table. I'll finish packing today, she said gently. The words landed like a quiet echo. Sophie's lip trembled. No, she whispered. Clara's hands paused, but only for a second. Daniel stepped forward. That's enough, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried something it hadn't before, finality. Clara looked at him, surprised. Daniel moved closer, his expression steady, not guarded, not distant, honest. You don't get to decide this alone, he said. Clara frowned slightly. This isn't about deciding. It's about doing what's right. For who? Daniel asked. For them, she replied without hesitation. Daniel shook his head. No, this is about what you think might happen. Clara's jaw tightened slightly. And what if I'm right? She said, what if I stay and they depend on me and something changes again? What if I become another loss they have to carry? Daniel didn't answer right away. Because that fear, he understood it. He had lived it. But this time, something in him refused to let it win. They've already lost someone, he said quietly. That's not something we can protect them from anymore. Clara's eyes flickered. But we can choose what they gain, he continued. The room fell still. They've gained you, Daniel said. Clara looked away. Temporarily. No, he said firmly. You made it more than that the moment you stayed. Clara's breath caught slightly. Daniel stepped closer, not invading her space, but not holding back either. You didn't replace anything, he said. You didn't take something that wasn't yours, his voice softened. You gave something we didn't have anymore. Clara's eyes lowered, her thoughts tangled in everything she was trying not to feel. Daniel continued, quieter now. And I've been afraid too, he admitted. That made her look up. Afraid of letting things feel normal again, he said. Afraid that if I allowed that, it would all disappear. His gaze met hers, but pushing it away doesn't stop that from happening. Clara didn't speak, because she knew he was right. Sophie slowly slipped down from her chair and walked toward Clara again, her small steps careful this time, like she wasn't sure if she'd be allowed to come close. She reached out, not pulling, not clinging, just holding. "You don't have to go," Sophie said softly. Clara looked down at her. Her chest tightened. Emma stood up from the table. "We're not asking you to stay because we need help," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. Clara listened. Emma took a breath. "We're asking you to stay because you belong here." The words hung in the air clear. Simple, undeniable. Lily stepped closer too, her voice quiet but present. "It feels better when you're here." That was all she said, but it was enough. Clara closed her eyes briefly. For so long, she had believed that leaving was the safest choice, that keeping distance meant protecting everyone from pain. But standing here now, looking at them, feeling what this had become, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. Leaving wouldn't protect them. It would hurt them. And maybe, just maybe, staying wasn't something to fear. It was something to choose. Clara slowly knelt down in front of Sophie, her voice soft but certain. "I don't want to leave," she said. Sophie's grip tightened slightly, hopeful. Clara stood again, her eyes meeting Daniel's. For the first time in a long time. "I don't feel like I'm passing through," she admitted. Daniel didn't interrupt. Clara took a breath. "I feel like I'm home." The word settled gently into the space between them. And this time, she didn't pull away from it. Daniel gave a small nod, something easing in his expression. Not relief, not victory, just understanding. Clara reached for her bag later that morning, not to finish packing, but to close it and set it aside. Not because the past no longer mattered, not because fear had disappeared, but because, despite all of it, she had made a choice to stay. And in that quiet decision, something fragile but powerful took root once again. Not temporary, not uncertain, but real. And for the first time since she arrived, Clara wasn't just someone passing through their lives. She was part of it. That the change didn't come all at once. There was no single moment where everything suddenly felt perfect, no grand declaration, no dramatic turning point. Instead, it unfolded the way most real things do, slowly, gently, and without needing to be announced. Weeks passed, then months, and the Harper farmhouse began to feel like something entirely different, not new, but renewed. The mornings came first. Sunlight would spill softly through the windows as the house stirred awake, not to silence anymore, but to quiet movement and familiar sounds. Clara was often in the kitchen, just as she had been from the beginning, but now it felt less like routine and more like belonging. She didn't stand apart from their lives. She stood within them. Sophie would wander in first most days, her hair messy, her steps still heavy with sleep. She no longer asked if Clara was staying. She already knew. Instead, she would wrap her arms around Clara's waist in a small, wordless hug before climbing into her seat. Lily followed, no longer lingering in doorways or hiding behind silence. She spoke more now, not constantly, not loudly, but with comfort. Her words came easier, her shoulders no longer drawn tight with unspoken weight. Emma had changed in ways that were harder to notice at first. She still helped around the house. She still took responsibility when needed, but she had started letting go of the things she was never meant to carry alone. She laughed more easily now. She asked for help when she needed it, and sometimes she just acted her age. Daniel noticed everything, even the smallest shifts. He noticed how the house no longer felt like something he had to hold together by force. It moved on its own, now balanced. Steady. Alive. Evenings became something he no longer avoided. The long days in the field still tired him, but when he stepped through the door, he no longer felt that quiet dread of returning to emptiness. Instead, there was warmth waiting, not loud, not overwhelming. Just there. Dinner became a time they shared, not something they endured. Conversations were simple small stories, quiet laughter, but they filled the space that had once been hollow. Clara sat with them every night, now not as a guest, not as someone helping, but as part of the family. And Daniel found himself changing too. He spoke more. Not all at once, not in long heavy conversations, but little things. Thoughts. Memories. Even small jokes that surprised the girls. When they slipped out, he smiled more often now, and this time it stayed. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, the family gathered outside. It had become something of a habit sitting together at the edge of the property, watching the sky change colors as the day came to an end. Sophie leaned against Clara, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Lily sat nearby, quietly reading but glancing up every now and then, as if she didn't want to miss anything. Emma lay back on the grass, her hands behind her head, watching the sky stretch endlessly above them. Daniel stood for a moment before joining them, lowering himself onto the ground beside Clara. There was no need for conversation. Not right away. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Comfortable. Daniel glanced at Clara. She was watching the horizon, her expression calm, at peace in a way he hadn't seen before. You stayed, he said quietly. Clara turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. I did, she replied. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just truth. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm glad, he said. Clara's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. So am I. The words were simple, but they carried everything that had come before them, everything they had faced, everything they had chosen. Sophie suddenly laughed at something only. She seemed to understand, and the sound carried across the open land. Emma rolled onto her side, teasing her gently. Lily smiled an easy, natural smile that no longer needed effort. Daniel watched them, then looked back at Clara. There were no promises spoken between them. No need to define what this was becoming, because it was already there. Built slowly. Carefully. Honestly. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something new, something real. The sun dipped lower, casting a warm golden glow over the fields, wrapping around them like a quiet embrace.